Hello YouTube, welcome to the second episode of the Educated Barbarian about the happy life by Seneca. Today's episode is going to be a little bit shorter because every single one that follows is going to be a double-decker, meaning that they are going to be 40 minutes long because they're going to cover two chapters. But since the chapters are numbered until 25, there must be at least one installment that is going to be only one chapter, and this is this one. And today's chapter is named, There Can Be No Happiness Without Virtue. Virtue is that perfect good, which is the complement of a happy life. The only immortal thing that belongs to mortality. It is the knowledge both of others and itself. It is an invincible greatness of mind, not to be elevated or dejected with good or ill fortune. I like the idea of virtue as something that is not indigenous to humans and that doesn't need us to exist. It's like a concept that is above it all, and therefore it exists in nature, and that makes it both immortal and also accessible to anyone who is willing to tap into it. And I think that's an excellent way to open that chapter, because if you're going to say that happiness relies on virtue, you need then to also express the idea that anyone can achieve said virtue, and that is something that Seneca does almost immediately. It is the only immortal thing that belongs to mortality. Very well said too, because if you think about it, nothing that is in our realm that we utilize or that we interact with is immortal. Everything will disappear eventually, but not virtue. Virtue is the one exception. One may be a good physician without being a good man, so that all things from without are only accessories, for the seat of it is a pure and holy mind. Very interesting too, the idea that anyone can achieve virtue, and that social status, for example, that is one of the many declination of human status that you can achieve, is not conducive to the actual achievement of virtue, meaning that you don't need to be rich to be virtuous, but you also don't need to be poor. And that a man that is gifted or a good worker at a certain task is not virtuous. They're good. That's different. You can be good at something and not be virtuous. Virtue is something else. It's something that is found within, and therefore it does not concern itself with external factors. And to me, that is also key, because a lot of people, if they were to describe to you what virtue is, they would tell you, okay, to be virtuous, you need to do this. But that is external. And before being external, virtue is internal, because it's the expression of a pure self, from within to the outside. Too many people focus only, in their entirety, on the outside factor, meaning that their very virtue is shallow, because they do that for show. It's what we call, in our modern age, virtue signaling. It's when you're trying to show people intently that you are virtuous, but in truth you are not. And the very fact that you're trying to make a show of it is a proof. When we come once to value our flesh above our honesty, we are lost. And that ties directly to this. When you want people to believe you're virtuous, why do you do that? You do that because you understand that virtue is seen as something positive in our society, and therefore it heightens your social status. People look at you with a benevolent eye, and that is prioritizing the flesh over the soul. And that means that you're lost, because that type of behavior not only is not virtuous, but you could even deem it sinful. And sinful not because it's bad, although it is, but more importantly because it closes the door of virtue in your face. Because you will now never achieve it, as you are constantly trying to chase an expression of virtue instead of virtue itself. Short life, grief, and pain are accessions that have no effect at all upon virtue. It consists in the action and not in the things we do, in the choice itself and not in the subject matter of it. So, the difficulties of life, as well as the status you might have within said life, have no impact on virtue. Meaning what? Meaning that it might not be a necessary trait to possess to develop it, but more importantly, once it is developed, it doesn't have the ability to remove it from the self. That is important. A lot of people I know, me included, have a certain level of separation anxiety when it comes to things that are not material, meaning that you might have qualities of values that you've developed that you're worried you will lose at some point. And Seneca tells you that there is no such thing. Virtue will not leave you by the action of external factors. Only the internal can affect the internal. And since virtue, true virtue, is within, the only way to be rid of it is through internal work. So if you degrade yourself, if you debase yourself as a human, then virtue will leave you, but not the difficulties of life. Because virtue is first and foremost an internal factor that expresses itself in the action and not in the things we do. So this is confusing, right? It consists in the action and not in the things we do. Shouldn't that be the same thing? Isn't virtue something that you do? Well, yes, but not in the fashion that I've described. Just because you did something virtuous doesn't make you virtuous. You did that virtuous thing because you are virtuous. You see the difference? If there's an arrow pointing towards the action, some people will think because the arrow has been effectively carried out and the action has been accomplished, it means I'm virtuous. But it's the other way around. You are virtuous, therefore you carry the action, not you carry the action, therefore you're virtuous. And so that is what he means by action. Virtue is something that you do that then takes the form of external events or, interactions with your environment. He that looks diligently into the state of a wicked man will see the canker at his heart, through all the force and dazzling splendors of greatness and fortune. We shall then discover our childishness in setting our hearts upon things trivial and contemptible, and in the settling of our very country and parents for a rattle. And what is the difference between old men and children? But that the one deals in paintings and statues, and the other in babies, so that we ourselves are only the more expensive fools. I have a certain fondness for that passage and another one that I'm going to cite later, because he truly expresses the idea that virtue is not something that comes with age, and it's something that I've always believed. I have met people in their 50s and 60s that were absolutely garbage people, and something that they all had in common is that they were extremely focused on the expression of external virtue when within themselves they were putrid. And he expresses that too. You could see the cankers at their heart. I know you know people like this, where they are constantly trying to be moral and virtuous, but you see right through their bullshit. You can see that at their heart, that's not who they are. And this is dangerous. Because at the end of the day, if you live a life like this, you are no better than a kid. You never evolved. And a lot of adults are like this, which is what he describes. They might have grown, but they concern themselves with the same childishness as kids. And therefore, virtue is in a part that it's moving away from your childishness. I'm going to define that later. It's very important. If one could but see the mind of a good man, would not a man bless himself at the sight of such an object as at the encounter of some supernatural power? Very true. I've met few people in my life who were truly virtuous, and every single time I felt that sense of awe. Just like when I enter a church, I always feel that same thing like all churches where there is a spirit there. I feel something in me. And it's the same with some of the men and women I met. I can cite you two examples if you're interested. The first one was my boxing coach when I was 19, who was a man with sharp intents. He had a presence about him, a lot of charisma. But the most important thing is that he was radiating virtue. You could see that this man was a man of his word, a man of no ill and no evil, which is extremely rare because I personally am not like that. I have many evils in my heart. But he was old. He was 55, 60. And you could sense that he had spent a long life working on himself. And he had reached a point that I would only describe as enlightenment. And that enlightenment shone through. And the second one was a woman that I met when I was working a certain job. And just with her sitting in front of me, I could sense that virtue. And if the first person felt sort of like a Buddha of enlightenment, she felt like the Virgin Mary to me. Meaning that this is the image that I saw appear in my mind during the interaction. She was pure, but not naive. There was a lot of energy in her, and I could tell that I better do my job properly, or else I would get in troubles with her. So you see, these people did nothing virtuous to impress me. Their virtue transpired through their very existence, their very person. And so I wished I could have blessed myself. It would have been ridiculous, of course, and I think they would not have appreciated that at all. Because virtuous people tend to dislike when you preach their virtue. Because to them, it's not something they do for the world. It's something they do for themselves. That's the sign of someone who's truly virtuous. When you praise them for it, they usually blush or they usually recoil because they understand that this is impure. You're trying to make their action something that it's not. That even the worst of men approve of it, of the virtue I just described, and set up for the reputation of being accounted virtuous themselves. We all want to be called virtuous. Isn't that interesting? Why? Because outside of culture and religion, a lot of people say, oh, morals exist because of religion. I don't believe that 1 second. I believe that morals dictated religions and not the other way around. We are virtuous creatures that strive towards virtue, but are also very tempted by evil because evil is easy and pleasurable and virtue takes work. And yet our hearts cannot deny that we love virtue. And a heart that pretends the opposite is a heart that is lying to itself, or one that is so deeply denatured that it has stopped being human. They covet the fruit indeed, and the profit of wickedness, but they hate and are ashamed of the imputation of it. It is by an impression of nature that all men have a reverence for virtue. They know it and they have a respect for it, though they do not practice it. Nay, for the contentment of their very wickedness, they miscall it virtue. Their injuries they call benefits, and expect a man should thank them for doing him a mischief. They cover their most notorious iniquities with a pretext of justice. This man just described our current society. The people in our modern world that claim to be the most moral, the more virtuous, end up being the biggest scum times and times again. Why? Because someone who is truly virtuous wouldn't want people to know that they are. Apply that in your life, because these people are dangerous. There are snakes in the grass. And so all men think like this. We like the fruit of sin because sin is pleasurable and you can make a lot of profit if you're willing to be wicked. But you also hate the idea of people thinking that you're evil, and you would even be ashamed of it in your own self. And so there is that combat inside your heart between the you that is constantly trying to resist evil and the you that is more interested in pretending to be virtuous to be able to be evil by using that as a cover. And of course, you know which part you're supposed to feed. He that robs upon the highway had rather find his booty than force it. Ask any of them that live upon rapine, fraud, oppression, if they had not rather enjoy a fortune honestly gotten, and their consciences will not suffer them to deny it. Men are vicious only for the proof of villainy, for at the same time that they commit it, they condemn it. Nay, so powerful is virtue, and so gracious is providence, that every man has a light set up within him for a guide, which we do all of us both see and acknowledge, though we do not pursue it. So again, the idea that even the most wicked and evil of men was gifted with the light of virtue. Some choose to just ignore it. And actually, You could say, oh, well, this doesn't mean that we should forgive. No, quite the opposite. We should condemn. Because no one has the excuse of being born evil. If you're human, you cannot be born evil, save for rare exceptions. And even those exceptions only had a higher propensity for evil, but they were not entirely so. They had a chance to be virtuous, and they just refused to actually take that chance. And this is why also the very idea of sin being inevitable is flawed. It's not inevitable in action, it's inevitable in thought. But you can have a life that is devoid of it if you so decide. But this paragraph shows, that even the most wicked of men cannot, in their own good conscience, tell out loud and say out loud and claim that what they're doing is virtuous. They just cannot. Because deep down they still are aiming for that virtue. It's just that they are too weak to pursue it. And it's interesting that he says something that I think applies to this day. The fact that they had not rather enjoy a fortune honestly gotten. I think that this applies, for example, to prostitutes. I think that if you ask the prostitute, hey, would you not rather have a normal job? They would say yes. But the reason why they do that job is because it's easier. And therefore, they have chosen the path of profit over the path of virtue. And of course, as Seneca explains, there are injuries they call benefits. And that's the problem too. It's that very interesting cycle that you see in humans where we love virtue so much that when we do something that is not virtuous and that we know is not, we try to find pathways to explain why it is, to be able to live with ourselves. And to go back to the example of prostitution, is the reason why you have people nowadays who claim that you have to respect sex workers. That's what they're doing. They see evil, but instead of trying to combat it, they say, no, if we call evil virtue, then it's not evil anymore. And in a sense, they're correct, but also deeply wrong, because they're just hurting themselves more and more as they refuse to pursue true virtue. The state of things divine is always the same, and so is virtue. It is the same in a rich man and in a poor. There are some virtues, I confess, which a good man cannot be without. And so this means that in this case, the state of virtue is present in all of us, and it is also the same in all of us. And that for him, according to him and his Stoic mindset, there are certain virtues that are unavoidable and that to him make the great man. Let's see how he continues that statement. If a man does not live up to his own rules, it is something yet to have virtuous meditations and good purposes, even without acting. There is something of honor yet in the miscarriage, nay, in the naked contemplation of it. So he balances it out. What is being described here is what I believe to be a certain level of relativism that makes virtue a more attainable feat. Because if we are to pursue it, it needs to be realistic. And I do believe that it is very realistic, but a lot of ideologies and philosophies that want you to be virtuous make it so that they make it look daunting, and it's tough for you to embrace that path. Seneca tells you that the very idea and contemplation of wanting to be virtuous is already good, because it means that it most likely is going to lead to virtue down the line. Virtue is divided into two parts, contemplation and action. The one is delivered by institution, the other by admonition. One part of virtue consists in discipline, the other in exercise. For we must first learn and then practice. So that's what I just said. It's like people who wonder how they can get motivated to do things they want to do. Well, first and foremost, you need to think about it. Any action you do starts in your brain and then takes place in the wood. And therefore, you cannot do without that contemplation. So it is important, of course. Contemplation only is not enough. You need also action, because one prepares the other. And the other action, in my opinion, fuels the other one. Because when you actually achieve your contemplations, it makes the act of doing them correlated with the reciprocation of the contemplation that returns. Because you have convinced yourself that what you can think of, you can do. And therefore, you're going to want to do more and more things. So that's excellent. We have the authority of seniors and the weaknesses of children. And that's again the fondness that I have for this paragraph, due to the fact that it touches on something very important. It touches on the evolution of virtue within man and how some people fail at it entirely. A child is virtuous by default because they fail to understand the nature of it. But the more you age, the more you understand that virtue, the more you ought to actually carry it out. And yet, a lot of people will have the authority and the behavior of one who have been seeking virtue, but they'll have the actual virtue of a kid because they never actually worked on it. So they have the weaknesses of both ages, and that is something you want to avoid. Whoever studies this point will find that many things are the less to be feared, the more terrible they appear. That is a more general statement, but I believe this to be true. Most of the things that we see as very dangerous, that we fear the most, are the ones that we must fear the less, because at the end of the day, they are just fruits of our imagination, just like with any fear. But most importantly, with the ones that appear the most striking. Your instinct is going to tell you that certain things are to be avoided. And yet, if you look at it through the lens of virtue, you will see that these are not the true demons in your life that need to be prevented. The real demons are the ones who are dragging you away from virtue. And that is what he's trying to express here. That which is right is not to be valued by quantity, number, or time. That is virtue. Virtue has no monetary value. And if you can value something based on these metrics, most likely it has nothing to do with virtue. For virtue is open to all. It is profitable to the world and to itself, and there is no difficulty can excuse a man from the exercise of it, and it is only to be found in a wise man, though there may be some faint resemblance of it in the common people. So that's something that he's expressed also, is anyone can actually achieve virtue. Virtue is not only good for you, but also for the world, so it's not self-profit. And it's not difficult, meaning that no one has an excuse to not be virtuous. A man that cannot be virtuous does not exist. And all wise men share that quality. Nothing can be good which gives neither greatness nor security to the mind, but on the contrary, infects it with insolence, arrogance, and tumor. A mindset that is also prevalent in Nietzsche, and we're going to get to that. I can already tell you that the first book of Nietzsche we're going to be reading together is going to be the Genealogy of Morals. I think that's the translation. And then I'm thinking of doing also Dostoevsky and Jung, so it's going to be a 3-book cycle just like this one. And then we'll see, if you guys really like Nietzsche, we might do another book by Nietzsche, maybe Zarathustra, who knows, because we'll be more versed in the entire grand idea behind his work. But what is expressed here is that it is extremely dangerous to seek things that give no security to the mind. And all of what he describes is that insolence, arrogance, tumor, etc., etc. He that depends upon any other good becomes covetous of life. Virtue is free and indefatigable, and accompanied with concord and gratefulness, whereas pleasure is mean, servile, transitory, tiresome, and sickly and scarce outlives the tasting of it. So he's comparing things that some people might deem as virtuous and the actual nature of virtue and what it does for you. Those two are very different, because virtue brings security. Again, it's something I've seen with the people that I've described, where you could sense that they were very secure about themselves. Insecure people are not virtuous, because you are much more likely to lash out in anger and to be mean when you do not have a strong self-belief of who you are and what you are worth in this life. Who does not know that falls... Oh, sorry. That's a strange sentence. Who does not know that fools enjoy their pleasures and that there is great variety of the entertainments of wickedness? That's an actual question. So, this is also speaking against the very pursuit of pleasure, because a lot of people actually confuse pleasure and virtue, and they think that anything that is pleasurable is virtuous. And in a sense, that's hedonism, right? That is the pursuit of what the body likes, correlated to what the soul wants, because of course they go hand in hand. When in reality, they couldn't be more opposed. And the only people who buy into that are usually idiots and fools, because they are low enough that their instinct has managed to dictate their entire life. And I think we're going to stop here, actually. I think it's a good place to stop, because the chapter 4 follows right afterwards, and I have a certain number of things that I want to say that is going to connect to that one. So I'm going to leave you with that, and I'll see you next week for another episode of the Educated Barbarian. Have a good night.